Hi, I'm Mikey. Welcome to my sewing room. I had a comment on one of my recent videos asking how I made this pincushion. Well, that's what we're going to do today. We're going to have a look at that. I'm going to make two different versions of it. They're both made using 2.5-inch squares, and the only difference is the way that you attach the top. If you're ready, let's go over to the sewing table and have a look how it's done. To make either of the pincushions, you'll need some scraps of fabric, just enough so that you can make 15 2.5-inch squares. If you're using contrasting fabrics like me, you'll need to make 5 from each colour. You'll also need a rotary blade or some scissors to cut out your squares, and if you're using a rotary blade, of course you'll need some rulers. You'll need a pen to mark the back of your squares. I'm using a friction pen here, which is heat erasable, but you could also use a water-soluble marker as well. It's not hugely important as this won't be seen from the outside of the finished project. And lastly, you'll need a single button to place on the top of your pincushion. To fill your pincushion, you'll also need some kind of stuffing. I'm using polyester fibre fill, but you could also use scraps of fabric or even rice. To cut out my squares, I'm going to start with my fabric stacked. You could of course cut them individually as well. The first thing I'll do is place my ruler on top and slice off those edges so that I've got a nice straight line to work with. To help prevent the ruler from slipping, I'll cut a small section, reposition my hand, and then cut to the end. Next, I need to cut a 2.5-inch strip from the fabric, so I'll line up the 2.5-inch line on my ruler with the nice straight line that we just made. You can see that I'm using the same technique here, so I'm being sure to reposition my hand as I move the rotary blade across the fabric. One more thing to do with that strip of fabric before I start cutting it into squares, and that's just to get rid of that little raw edge. So I'll just trim that off with my rotary cutter, and then I'll line up my 2.5-inch line on my ruler with the nice straight edge that I just cut, so that I can be sure that I'm cutting into 2.5-inch squares. And then I'll just repeat that all the way across until I have enough squares. Once all the cutting's done, we need to mark the back of each square. We need to mark 1/4 inch in from each side to make it easier to see where we're going to start and stop later. And it doesn't hurt to have a line to sew along. On each piece, I'll line up my ruler like this and just draw a straight line, and then I'm going to turn the piece 90 degrees and draw another line on the next side. I'll do this all the way around, and I'll do this on every piece until I've finished. I'm using a friction pen here, so this is heat erasable. You also could use a water erasable pen, but because this isn't going to be seen from the outside, you can use any kind of marking tool that you like. And I'll just speed through this part so that you can see that I really am marking the back of every single piece of fabric. Here's the last one, and once that's done, we're ready to start sewing the pieces together. We'll work on the top piece first, and we'll just take 2 pieces and place them right sides together. We'll place a couple of pins in, and then we'll take them over to the sewing machine and sew at 1/4 inch. It's important that you start and stop where you drew those lines, so you're going to start 1/4 inch from the end and finish 1/4 inch from the end. And that will make sure that we leave those ends open so that we can stitch the next pieces on and close up that gap. At the machine, as I place my piece under the presser foot, I'll really take my time to make sure that the needle lines up with the markings that I drew earlier. As long as I start in the corner and finish in the corner, I'll know that I'm 1/4 inch from the edge. Then I'm going to use my hand wheel to drop the needle into the fabric and make sure I'm in exactly the right place. And then I'll backstitch at the beginning and at the end. You can see here that there's a small opening at the top and the bottom of the seam. That's completely normal, and it's exactly what we want. That means that when we line up the next piece, we can start to stitch exactly where we stopped stitching on this piece. I'll take my next square and line it up with the bottom of the piece that I just stitched. I'm going to place them right sides together, place a pin, and then take them over to the machine. I'll I'll stitch in the same way, making sure to start and finish 1/4 inch from the edge. At the machine you can see that I'm careful to line everything up again, but this time when I drop the needle I want to make sure that it goes into the very last stitch that I made. That way, this line of stitching starts exactly where the last line of stitching stops, and when we turn it right side out there'll be no gaps. And once again I'll backstitch at the beginning and at the end. Here's what it looks like so far. We have 2 seams and 3 pieces stitched together. The next piece is going to go exactly where you'd expect it to go, into that gap, so that it looks as though we're going to sew a square. We'll place them right sides together and add a pin, and then we'll use the same technique as before to stitch. Again, make sure you start and stop 1/4 inch from each edge. Because we've got lots of pieces stitched together now, it can feel like the other pieces are in the way a little bit. Just really take your time here, make sure you line everything up, and make sure that the seams are pushed back and out of the way of the needle. Just as before, we'll backstitch at the beginning and at the end. And here's what it looks like so far. Looks a little bit like a square, but when we pull apart pieces 1 and 4, this is where we're going to place piece number 5. We'll take it 1 seam at a time, so place them right sides together, place a pin, and then stitch just as before. With 5 squares of fabric all stitched together, the centre can start to get a little bulky here. Just make sure everything's pushed back and out of the way before you start to stitch. Is the piece that we just stitched, and we have 1 more seam to finish. When you turn the piece right side up, you'll see that we already have the star shape that we're aiming for. So the last thing to do is to close up that gap between the 1st and the 5th pieces. Place them right sides together, add a pin, and we'll take them over to the machine and stitch again. With the last piece, you can see that I'm being really careful to push everything out of the way so that nothing that I've already stitched goes under the presser foot. I'll slide the piece in from the back, put my presser foot down, and just as before, lower my needle to make sure that I'm starting exactly on the end of the previous stitch line. Once more, I'll backstitch at the beginning and at the end. So that's the top piece completed, and you can see if I pull the pieces apart, there are no gaps between any of the seams. And the bottom piece is stitched in exactly the same way as the top piece. Once you've finished stitching the top and the bottom, it's time to add a button onto the top piece. And now we'll add the side pieces, and once again this is the same for either of the pin cushions. We'll take the first of our side pieces and line it up so that the corner of the side piece matches the seam of the bottom piece. We'll place the pieces right sides together and then flip over so that we can see the previous stitching lines. Pin it in place and we'll take it over to the sewing machine. I'll keep using the same technique, lowering the presser foot onto the fabric and then manually lowering the needle into the end of the previous stitch line. If you're comfortable with this part, you can do it over at the sewing machine, but I've brought it over to my cutting mat so that I can show you exactly what's going on. I'm pivoting the side piece of fabric so that I can join it to the next square along the bottom. Remember, the corner of the side piece should match the seam of the bottom piece. Once again, I'm just pushing everything back and out of the way. I'll lower the needle into the fabric on the previous line of stitches and stitch just as before. Here's what you should have, and we're just going to repeat that process all the way around until all of the side squares are added to the bottom. Here's what you should have. And I have another one here because this is where things start getting different depending on which pincushion you're going to make. And I also have the tops here for each pincushion, which were made in the same way. I'm going to start with the star pincushion. For this, I'll place the pieces right sides together with the points matching. So the points of the top should match the points of the sides. This one's probably the easier of the two, as we're going to sew all the way around with one continuous stitch. However, we will leave a small opening for turning through. With all of my pins in place, I'm going to mark my opening, and I just need to make sure that this opening is big enough to slide my finger through. You can see here are the marks that I made, so I'll start sewing at the end of the opening and finish sewing at the beginning of the opening. I'll pivot at each corner with the needle in the fabric. It's really important that we backstitch at the beginning and the end of this seam because this is going to be used to turn the whole thing through. You can see here I've come to the corner. All I'm going to do is lift my presser foot, turn the whole piece around and lower the presser foot again. I'm just making sure that those seams match up so that when I turn it through, it's nice and neat. And again, once I get to the corner, I'll leave the needle down, lift the presser foot up and turn the whole piece around so that I can sew the next seam. I'm onto the last seam now, and as I mentioned, I'm going to stop at the beginning of that opening. I need to stitch all the way up to the line and then make sure I backstitch so that when I turn it through I have a nice strong seam. Once we've finished sewing, this is what it looks like. Now it's time to turn it through. Because it's such a small gap, the easiest way to turn it through is to insert either a finger or a thumb and find the part that's the furthest away from the opening. Push that part through the hole and then pull the rest of the fabric down around it. When you've pulled it through as much as you can, it's time to bring out the tools. My tool of choice for this is a chopstick, but you could also use a pen or a pencil, or if you have a point turner, you could use that here too. I'll gently push out each of the corners and manipulate the seams until I have nice sharp points. Before we move on to filling, let's take a look at how to make the round pincushion. Instead of matching the points, this time the points will go in between the side pieces. We'll use a similar technique to the way that we joined the side pieces, except this time all of the top pieces are already joined together. We'll start by pinning and joining the first edge just with a straight stitch. We need to join this seam to the stitch line holding the top pieces together to make sure there are no gaps. And don't forget to backstitch at the beginning and the end. Here's a look at that first seam, and we'll use a technique now that's similar to the way that we joined the side panels onto the bottom. So we'll pivot the top piece around, add a pin, and sew the very next seam. And once we've finished stitching this one, then we can add an opening for turning through. As we've done before, we want to match up this seam to the previous seam. Line it up, manually drop your needle, and adjust the fabric if you need to make sure you're in the right place. In this next seam, we're going to leave an opening for turning through. Really, you can leave this in any of the seams, but I'd just like to show it here to demonstrate how it's done. Once I've lined my pieces up, I'll take my pen and mark some lines where the opening's going to be. And remember, this needs to be big enough to slide in a finger or a thumb so that you can turn through later. Then once I have those markings over at the machine, I'll know where to stop stitching and where to start stitching so that I can leave an opening to turn through. Now, I definitely want to backstitch here no matter how small the seam is, because this needs to be nice and strong. Remember, we're going to be pulling against this seam when we turn everything right side out. You actually could leave this seam completely open, but I find that when you're stitching it up later by hand, it helps to have the seam already started rather than starting from the corners. Next, stitch the rest of the seams in the same way that you did the first two, and then we'll turn everything the right side out. Once you're done stitching everything, this is what you should be left with. So it does look different to the first one, and you can see that this one is more of a ball shape rather than the star shape. We'll find the opening that we left and turn it through, and then I like to find the furthest point away and push that through the hole and then pull the rest of the fabric down around it. This one is slightly easier to pull through than the star one because of the shape, but I'm still going to use the chopstick just to push out those points and make sure that everything is nice and neat. When I finish turning through, I'll show you a comparison to the one that I use every day, and you can see that this one is slightly smaller. For the one that I use every day, I think I used 3-inch squares, and this one's 2.5. Okay, let's move on to filling. To fill, you're going to need some stuffing, either toy stuffing or fabric scraps. You could use rice for this, there's lots of different options. What I will say, if you're using toy stuffing, you will need a lot more than you think you're going to need. This pile that's on the table right now, I will use all of this in the star pincushion and go back and get some more. I want you to see the whole process, so I'll speed this up, but you'll see that despite the huge pile of stuffing on the table, I do need to go and get some more. This is at around about 10 times the speed. It actually took me around about 5 minutes to stuff this pincushion. I like to be very deliberate with where I'm placing the stuffing to make sure that I get the shape that I want. So I've used that huge pile that was on the table already. There wasn't enough, so I've been and got some more. It's not quite the same amount, but almost. And then once I've finished filling, just some slight little tweaks to the shape to make sure that it looks right. I'll move on to filling the round one. I won't show the whole process of this one because it took just as long, and I don't want to bore you with more of the same footage. When you're happy with the filling, it's time to close up those gaps. We'll do this by hand just with a needle and thread, and we're going to start just by tying a nice heavy double knot. This is a technique actually that my grandmother taught me when I was very young. So I wrap the end of the thread around my finger and then twist the loop off my finger and pull down. It's similar to a tailor's knot, but it leaves a much bigger knot, and that means that it won't come through the fabric when you're pulling on the needle. Whether you've made the star pincushion or the round one, this is the technique you'll need to close the gap. Once you've got your knot secured, we'll push the needle in through the opening and then up through the fabric where the seam is. That way you can't see where the seam starts and there are no loose threads to tie off or anything like that. Next, I'll go to the opposite side of the fabric and push the needle in. I'll go up by 1/8 of an inch or so underneath and then bring the needle up through the fabric. Then I'm going to go back over to the first side at the same height that I've just come out of, push the needle in and do the same again. And I'll do this all the way up the seam until I get to the end. This is a variation on the ladder stitch. In case I didn't explain that very well, here's what your stitching should look like, only you won't see it from the outside once you pull the thread tight. When you get to the end of the seam, push your needle all the way through and leave a small loop. We'll use the loop to create a knot to tie off the thread. Push your needle through the loop and pull, and that creates the knot. We'll do this once more to create a double knot, and then push the needle all the way through and trim off the thread. You can see what I've done here is push the needle into one side of the pincushion and pushed it all the way through to the other side. Once it's through, I can grab my scissors and just trim off that thread, and then that will sit inside the pincushion and there'll be no loose threads on the outside. And that's it, we're all done. Don't forget to tag me in your finished makes over on Instagram. Here's a look at some of the pincushions that I've made. If you made it this far, you're a superstar. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this video useful, please let me know down in the comments below, or you can leave me a thumbs up. You can of course come and chat with me over on Instagram as well. Here is what YouTube thinks that you may want to watch next. And here is where you can subscribe to my channel. Until next time, happy sewing, and hopefully I'll see you again soon.